start tonight's debate, I would address the elephant in the room, or the elephant that I guess isn't in the room tonight. I understand the optics of hosting a debate without an opponent. But the truth is, I've spent the last 4 years traveling up and down our beautiful district, talking to people in public town halls, and the vast majority of constituents, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, want to hear from candidates and elected officials. They miss debates. This has been an integral part of our election system since Abraham Lincoln and good old Douglas fought it out on stage 200 years ago. Tonight is the best of our ability to make this work. And I do want to let you know, first and foremost, a huge shout out to the Centennial Little Theater operators. Our tech guy, who normally is the wizard of all things tech, had an unfortunate injury. So can you please help me give up a round of applause to the students who are helping us tonight? So just a heads up, things that will vary a little bit from a normal debate. Obviously, there won't be rebuttals. So we have collected whatever public television interview, YouTube interviews that we could of Russ Fulcher. This means the times might be a little all over the place. Some answers might be shorter than others, some might be a little long-winded, but especially on my side. But there won't be a rebuttal, so Russ Fulcher will always answer first. We have his audio that'll come through the stereo. The cardboard cutout is not speaking tonight. And then I will speak, and then at the end, we'll kind of wrap everything up. If there is an important national issue that you do not hear covered tonight, that is because we couldn't find the content or the audio to make it work. So my hope is that by hosting these events, not just here in Boise, but in Lewiston, in Coeur d'Alene, in Wallace, Idaho, that we can force Russ Fulcher to start addressing the issues that people want to hear about. Or prove me wrong. All right, now I'm going to go back to just a normal debate participant, and I'll hand it off to the lovely Lindsay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Lindsay Van Allen. I will be moderating this debate. As debating as it can be. And like Kaylee said, what we're going to do is I will ask a question. There will be some audio played from Representative Russ Fulcher, and then Kaylee will respond. Because Russ declined to come, we cannot do rebuttals back and forth, so it will not be a standard debate format, but fingers crossed, hopefully in the future. We're going to do introductions, again, because Congressman Russ Fulcher is not here tonight. I will be playing the part for just a moment. I will do his introduction, and then we'll have candidate Kaylee Peterson introduce herself. So, Congressman Russ Fulcher is a fourth-generation Idahoan who grew up in Meridian, Idaho. He graduated from Meridian High School, earned both a bachelor's and master's degree in business from Boise State University. Congressman Fulcher spent 24 years in the high-technology industry working for Micron and Presco Electronics. Congressman Fulcher served in the Idaho Senate for 10 years, 6 of those as Majority Caucus Chair. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives since January 2019. Congressman Fulcher currently sits in the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and the House Committee on Natural Resources. Previously, he sat in the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. Kaylee, if you could please introduce yourself to the audience tonight.
For those who don't know me, my name is Kaylee Peterson. I'm a 35-year-old working class mom of 2. My husband, Trevor, and I have been together 16 incredible years. We raised our 2 kids on a street that's named after my great-grandfather. My family homesteaded what is now the North Eagle foothills around 120 years ago. But I did not have a traditional trajectory to being a congressional candidate. I was raised by a single mom who worked 2 to 3 jobs at a time to make sure I had opportunities like theater and debate and incredible after-school programs. I then became a mom young at 21, and like so many other Idaho families, I couldn't afford the cost of childcare in Eagle, Idaho. So I became a stay-at-home mom who worked on the side part-time when I could or when the kids were sleeping. We became foster parents. I had my son, And it wasn't until really the 2016 election I decided I needed to get involved at the local level again. I was incredibly involved at a young age. I started working by the time I was 10 years old, building a resume by the time I was 12 and 13. I was a public speaker and advocate for diverse youth in Idaho's foster and school systems by the time I was 13, working with law enforcement, social workers, educators, and students on how to make sure every student has the best possible chance of success in the state of Idaho. I managed a local state-run campaign where I did volunteer and field organizing. And it wasn't until I was 30 years old I decided to go back to college. And I am currently still double majoring in criminal justice and political science. I was the chief of staff this year. But then I was recruited my freshman year at the College of Western Idaho to run for Congress back in 2022. And at the time, it was a district where they could not find a Democrat to run on the ballot because this district got no financial support, no press, no attention, no support from the National Party. It really was a dark, left-behind district. And I said, that's the one thing I can do. I know how to work harder than everybody else, and I know how to talk to people. And so I spent the last 4 years traveling up and down the district. We just officially hit 100,000 miles on the odometer. Building connections. And whether I am elected or not, the important part of this was connecting working class Idahoans with the political process, with their congressmen, showing them how to have a seat at the table. And that's how I got my start, and now we're here.
All right, question number 1. There are proposals to shift more authority of our federally managed public lands to the state, with some state and federal officials even suggesting the potential sale or transfer of those lands to private entities. How do you believe public land should be governed, and what risks or benefits do you see in changing the current structure?
And so if you look at the landscape of the state of Idaho, you've got 75%-ish of the landmass that is government controlled that you can't access readily, that you can't levy a property tax on for the most part, and then there's of course exemptions that are added to that. So a state like Idaho, there's only 5 where that number is more than 50%, but a state like Idaho is in a completely different position from a standard of governance than most states, because we simply don't control the resources under our feet. So I've made the statement on multiple occasions that we're tenants in this state to the federal government. The federal government's a landlord. Now, landlords have responsibilities, and so we call them on that for federal funds and those types of things, but we do not control our own destiny. We have created a system where we have a lose-lose scenario because we don't manage those lands. And so the fuel load builds up, right? And so instead of harvesting timber in a very responsible, environmentally friendly fashion and receiving the revenue stream and the jobs and the economic benefit of that, we don't. And then it turns from a profit center to a cost center because then a lightning strike hits or whatever, it goes up in smoke, and we're spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars trying to suppress it. So this is it's just a bad system right now. And I believe the answer is transferring a lot of the control to the management. I'm not saying we have to shift the ownership, that might be ideal, but realistically, shift the management from the federal government to the states, to the local shareholders. If you take a look at Department of Ag, Forest Service, Department of Interior, they're overwhelmed. The backlog, untouched maintenance backlog of the federal government on public lands is in the billions and billions and billions. They're way overwhelmed. They can't manage all this. And even if they had the resources to do it, which they don't, we've evolved the legal system into this situation where so-called environmental groups will sue anytime that there is a project proposed for timber or grazing or whatever. Lawsuits fly, gets all cobbled up. This needs an overhaul in the biggest of ways.
Kaylee,
Wednesday,
First, I think it's really important to address why there is so much fear around federally managed lands reverting back to the state. And it's because state-controlled lands, Idaho has already sold off, I believe it's 1.7 million acres, 41%, because they cannot affordably manage these lands themselves. The idea that the state of Idaho is in a place where it can manage 63% of this state when we are already in over $50 million budget shortfall is unrealistic. I think it's also really important to note the reason that the Forest Service and these federal agencies do not have the resources to manage these lands. And a huge part of that is this administration laying off thousands of our Forest Service workers, probationary agents, as well as experienced, knowledgeable people who knew how to manage this land better than anyone else. I have spoken with our Forest Service from Valley County up to Boundary. I have worked with the Forest Service Union and the federal agencies that are tasked with trying to manage this land. They don't need to revert control back to the state. They need resources. They need staffing. And we do not need to revert control back to the state to earn the kind of revenue that Idaho is looking for. There's agro-tourism, there's recreational leases, all of which with federal oversight and protection allows us to keep that public access open. And that's what the federal government should be, not a landlord, but like a security guard. Making sure that when we do lease these lands, when we do allow logging and mining, which nobody is saying we're gonna stop all of that, that there is an agency with proper oversight, making sure that our soil is clean, our water is clean, and local communities aren't tasked with the cleanup when we're left behind by private interests. And North Idahoans will already tell you they are looking at clear cutting on privately leased lands and lands that have been available for generations. Now it costs $500 for a hiking or a tent permit and $1,000 to get an RV on those lands. So I think we need to start looking at the federal government as a tool and a resource to allow the state to properly advise, because we have already created legislation that eases the relationship between federal partners and local stakeholders with the Good Neighbor Authority. There are solutions right there available for us to use, and we just need to actually start writing legislation to use it.
Candidates. Idaho's abortion laws are among the strictest in the country without a health exception. But there's also efforts for a ballot initiative that could restore broader access to reproductive health care for Idahoans. How do you believe Idaho should approach reproductive rights?
3 years ago, I approached the podium for the first time to give my speech on the House floor. I chose my topic intentionally, as it is an issue that I will always champion: protecting the lives of the unborn. There is no effort more worthy than supporting life. This issue defines our culture, our society, and our value system. Every year, I'm overwhelmed at the outpouring of effort, energy, and support that floods this cause. So thank you. And thank you to my colleagues in the House and Senate who join me in this fight. Thank you to the health practitioners working nonstop to provide resources to help new mothers choose life. Thanks to our advocates on the ground, from the airwaves to in person, for continually showing your support. And thank you to our pastors and religious organizations for seeking divine guidance and strength in this effort. I'm inspired by you all, and will keep doing everything I can to continue this fight to protect the unborn.
Please hold your boos to the end. Kaylee, same question.
This is one of the hardest issues to talk to our communities about, because there are so many people in this state who value pro-life stances. Now, we all define that differently, but every time I've asked, where does that belief come from? It is always biblical. It is always a personal faith standpoint. And then it's really important that we address, how are we supposed to legislate faith? We are supposed to be using maternal fetal specialists and OBGYNs and data and research in order to legislate the healthiest possible next generation of children in this country. If we decide to take Russ Fulcher's personal faith stance, which of the 613 commandments given by God in the Bible are we supposed to legislate? Which of the 45,000 denominations of Christianity in the world right now, whose interpretation is best? If we take one step over this line, then it is too far. Not to mention the number of Christians and people of all faiths who do not see life that way, who understand the scientific background of the different stages between a fetus and a child. And then we look at the consequences of the strictest abortion legislation in the country, which is what happened after the Dobbs decision. We have now lost 43% of our OBGYNs. There are women in my counties that don't have a provider within hours of their location. Rural health care, my district alone has lost 3 labor and delivery wards. And then there's a part of this we never actually talk about because it's a darker side of society. It's a part of society nobody's really talking about. The number of children experiencing abuse, neglect, food scarcity, the number of foster children who age out into homelessness because we cannot currently take care of America's children. And then lastly, I always say, is it more important that a law say what you want it to say or do what you want it to do? Because we have lived life without Roe v. Wade. And it did not stop abortions in this country, it just made them deadlier. And since Dobbs' decision has fallen, we've had over 65,000 rape-related pregnancies. The level of trauma that this has already caused is unfathomable. So I usually say by protecting reproductive rights, I'm trying to give Idaho real pro-life legislation. And that's where I'm at.
The impact of President Trump's tariffs has been felt by Idaho farmers, manufacturers, business owners, and consumers. Do you support the direction U.S. trade policy has taken, including the tariff increases? And what changes would you advocate for going forward?
Finding a lot of bad stuff, Diane, and that's the bottom line. At the end of the day, we're the stewards of the taxpayer in the nation, and so we're finding stuff, and part of this is due to Elon.
Well, it looks like that audio clip is not going to work for us. But I know from personal experience and from reading our congressman's stances that he believes that reciprocal tariffs are the best absolute policy, because if China is going to state that a trade percentage needs to be it, then they need to experience it back and forth. He talked about some short-term pain, but the long-term goal of bringing in money to the taxpayers. But I do want to talk about tariffs mainly because we are a rural district. And family farming is not just close and personal to my life, but almost every constituent across the district that I talk to. Small family farms filing bankruptcy is up 60% from the year before. And that year, it was up 55% from the year before that. The only people who can survive this kind of cost increase because of the tariffs are the already monopolized ag industries and businesses that are already pushing our small family farms out of this industry, making it impossible for them to compete. If you want to incentivize local manufacturing, American made, then you can't just cut off all affordable resources to small businesses, small farms that entrepreneurs rely on to try and compete in this market. I look at what these tariffs have done and the fact that they are bragging about raising over $200 billion in the fiscal year. But that money didn't come from China, it didn't come from Canada, it didn't come from some foreign adversary. It came from the backs of working class people in this country just trying to make it by. I think it is way better for local businesses, for a sense of foreign diplomacy, where we're not just looking at a statistic on a spreadsheet, but instead talking about the relationship, both professional of imports and exports, which have been done very successfully 15, 20 years ago. So I 100% think we need to reverse this tariff policy as quickly as possible. I think we instead need to invest resources into the small family farms that we all treasure so much, into tax incentives for small businesses and entrepreneurs, and making sure that it's our local entrepreneurs that are able to compete in this kind of market and not just the corporate giant monopolized ag industries that can afford the pain in the short term while they wait for the profits in the long term.
There have been efforts to scale back and reorganize the Department of Education and shift responsibilities to states and other federal agencies. What role do you think the federal government should play in education, and how would your approach affect students and schools in Idaho?
The Iowa Democrats want to continue to narrow choices as opposed to expanding them. That's simply the wrong approach. If we want to improve our education system, we have to improve the options and the competition within that system, just like everything else. The market will help determine the success of a certain program, and education is no different.
And when it comes to the education system too, I ask because you're on the House Committee of Education and Labor. This is becoming kind of a big issue kind of for Democrats, and it's becoming a very appealing type of issue for especially younger voters. We see the Democratic presidential candidates talking about doing away with student loan debt. We see them kind of offering free college type of solutions in order to kind of ramp up the enthusiasm behind their campaigns. What is the conservative or the Republican response to those types of agenda?
Well, first of all, education is fundamental to our quality of life, to our culture, and it would sound great just to eliminate all that debt and make everything free. But the bottom line is someone pays. And it's a classic Democrat trick, right? They want to offer something free, and oftentimes you get some short-term votes. Next thing you know, the debt continues to climb. The answer is not to try to just give things away. The answer is to allow the market to do these things, allow choice to proliferate, allow parents to be involved more with their kids' education. That's the answer. And this is, to some extent, we've been a victim of our own success. We've got an entire generation or a generation and a half now that's never really lived through a significantly bad downturn where you've had to make real hard decisions on a lot of things in life. And we've been so successful that there's this thinking process that, maybe the government should be in charge. Maybe the government should be the provider here. When in reality, the government is not a provider. The government is a consumer. And so I hate to say that, but if you look back in our history, there's been these corrections from time to time that has made people stop and think and come to the realization that, wait a minute here, the answer is not the government. And we've got a generation and a half who's never really experienced a solid downturn. And I hope that the education system and a choice mechanism and personal involvement will help change that, and that we can drive home the point that the real answer is not with government control.
Kaylee Peterson, same question to you.
You know, it's interesting, the perspective of a man in his 60s, because I can understand why he wouldn't recognize the incredibly impactful downturn that this generation has experienced. I was 18 in 2008. I watched the people that I went to school with who had the brightest possible future throw $150,000 away with predatory lenders to go to a school to get a job that no longer existed. This generation has experienced downturn after downturn, and it's important because my opponent on this stage comes from wealth. He was raised on a dairy farm in Meridian, but also with a family with a history of commercial real estate development. He went to college and followed that trajectory to success, so he's never had to face a housing market in which millennials will never be able to afford a home, if we are able to even afford rent at this point. But the reason education becomes so incredibly important in this measure is because we know that education is the #1 way that we can provide a brighter future for every student in this state, whether they're from rural Riggins or Boise, Idaho. We know that it's education that prevents substance abuse and child abuse. It's after-school programs that allow children opportunities to stay out of trouble and off the streets. It is after-school programs and an education that gave me the opportunity to build my life from scratch. And I look at the idea of school choice as the biggest sham that has ever existed. You go to Clearwater County, Shoshone County, Lewis County, Nez Perce County, Boundary County, there is no school choice. These are rural education systems dealing with the very little that they get. And the federal government continues to cut resources to public education. And then locally, we have to increase property taxes, which makes everybody incredibly frustrated, especially when public education is struggling right now. Where instead, we actually invested fully federally funding public education for every student in this country, limiting class sizes, ensuring proper facilities, ensuring adequate teacher pay so that we don't lose Idaho teachers to Washington and Oregon. And it's far too expensive not to make this investment. Because as future generations make less and less money, have less and less opportunities, that means less and less revenue for the country in which to invest, which is why our budget hurts, because we've failed to invest in what's actually important. And I think it's really, really important to also note the amount of dark money that was funneled into the state of Idaho to lift up school choice. For an industry that only educates 7% of our children, and every other state where school vouchers and school choice has become an option, 90% of the students that use that program were already privately educated. It is only Idaho's rural students who will suffer the consequences, and I don't think we can afford to make that mistake.
Rural hospitals in Idaho have warned that Medicaid cuts will threaten their ability to operate, especially in already underserved areas. What is your plan to support rural healthcare and ensure long-term viability for these providers?
Well, once again, incredibly complex subject, but I would address that by saying this. I think somewhere in the last decade or two, we've gotten insurance confused with healthcare. And they're two wildly separate things, or by definition they are, but in reality they're not. And part of the reason we've confused insurance with healthcare is because of government involvement through Medicare, Medicaid, and basically defining what processes, what procedures can be covered and what can't. And so the government has really injected itself. Affordable Care Act, in my opinion, was never designed to be affordable, and it was never designed to maximize care. It was designed to break the system so that government would need to be a single provider, a single payer. And I think that's played out. We just saw some data last week that healthcare costs has increased over 80% on average just since the Affordable Care Act got put into place. And that, in my opinion, is why, is because we've inserted government into all these programs. The answer, I believe, is to do what has made America great in terms of prosperity. Let the markets work. We've got to empower our markets. The market system, free market works if you let it. But we've intervened so much in the healthcare space by putting programs in place, and there needs to be, there's some vulnerable that's got to have some protections and whatnot. But what we've done is we've expanded the government involvement to involve just about everybody, regardless of the circumstances.
Kaylee Peterson, same question.
This one is an incredibly personal issue to so many people in this room because we are looking at health insurance premiums increasing by at least 100% for the vast majority of the people on our current market. And as somebody who has struggled to get health insurance, as somebody who has actually had to pay out of pocket to ensure my children are seen, this is an incredibly important issue, if not the most important issue that we can be talking about. But I think it's also important to look back before the ACA at why the government became involved in the first place. And it's because when you allow insurance companies, when you allow private providers to follow their legal responsibility, which is to maximize profit for their shareholders over the wealth, the health and life and well-being of the people that they serve, then we saw exactly what happened before the ACA. People kicked off of their insurance because of pre-existing conditions. People facing a cancer diagnosis losing their health coverage. We have listened to insurance providers in congressional committee in the last 2 years admit to delaying and delaying and denying and creating such a difficult system that the coverage we pay for out of pocket as private consumers becomes useless to us. And I think we would do ourselves a great disservice if we did not look at how expensive our current free market system is right now. Because we are already paying vast amounts of money, over billions and billions of dollars each year just in indigent services. But if you make more than $36,000 a year, which is just roughly the average, then you don't get coverage. So you're paying anywhere from $500 to $1,500 a month for coverage that does not then actually cover your providers. And on top of that, when we're in a rural district like ours, there are entire communities without a single Medicaid provider. Locally, people are driving hours just to find somebody that these private insurers will cover. So I think what's more important right now is we look at where did the ACA go wrong? And I think we have allowed far too much power, far too much authority, and far too much involvement from health insurance companies, period. When we look at the billions that are spent by these companies lobbying Congress each year, then it becomes very evident who our Congresspeople work for. When we look at the fact that 90% of Humana's profits one year were covered by our taxpayer dollars through indigent services, there has been a mistake. When United Healthcare is currently being investigated for $80 billion of annual Medicaid fraud, then the government has to step up and protect the people of this country because healthcare is by far the most important thing we can do. And last, I just have to once again bring up, there is no free market competition in rural Idaho. It is not health insurance, health providers combating and competing for consumers' business. It is incredibly difficult to find any healthcare providers that are willing to even relocate to a rural district like ours. And if the government is not there to protect our quality of life, the literal lives and well-beings of our citizens, then what is the point of chasing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Also, and I just want to throw this out there because we don't talk about it enough, how expensive it is to have bad health care. There are entirely preventable illnesses, maintenance treatments that we could have so that the people of our state are healthy and also healthy enough to work in our local economies and stimulate local revenue. And when we don't have that, it becomes far more expensive for people who still can't afford the treatment. And that cost goes out to all of you, not to the health insurance companies. So I think the government's place is to step in and protect each and every person in this state from health insurance companies, from providers, making sure that there is equal access to a quality healthcare system.
The Big Beautiful Bill's tax cuts have sparked both support and concerns about their effect on working families and on the national debt. How do you assess the economic impact of these tax cuts, and what would your priorities be for future tax policy?
Yeah, so 1 a.m. happened to be the timeline for the earliest. At the same time, there is a desire by leadership to get this all done and package that in multiple committees to try to get this ready so that we can get this by Memorial Day. But this is a big bill. This contains a lot of critical components. The president came, as you mentioned, to the GOP conference yesterday, drove home how critical this was, not just for the economic, but for the social future of the country. So, large projects, big bills, a lot of content doesn't happen easily, and we're experiencing that in taxes on people. The energy component we all need. The United States has got a tremendous growth demand for energy, and we need to be in front of that, be energy exporters. Of course, all things border, and the president drove this home yesterday again.
Same question to you, Kaylee.
The Big Beautiful Bill, as they like to call it, I have watched our congressman brag for nearly 6 months straight about the KEEP Act, about eliminating tax on overtime and tips and Social Security and increasing the amount of take-home pay for everyday working class people in this state, but that is not what has happened. The bottom 20% of people in this country will save roughly $150 with this bill. while we continue to give even more tax cuts to the top tax brackets. Let's look at 1975. When people talk about the golden age and the good old days, in 1975, our corporate tax rate was 48%, and we are fighting and clawing to increase it by even 2% when it's down at 25 and 27%. And it's important that we have a real conversation about this, because when I talk about the 1% and top tax brackets, so many people in the state think about the American success story. They think that I'm talking about somebody who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, created a successful product, and earned the millions that we all wish we had. But that is not the reality of what the 1% in this country looks like. If you are a multi-millionaire, you are still only in the top 3% of earners, and you are closer to poverty than you are the 1%. The 1% currently has, I'm such a numbers person, so I don't want to get this wrong. The top 1% currently has roughly $17 trillion, while the bottom 50% of the globe has roughly $3.4 trillion. And yet we continue in this bill to give them more tax cuts, more breaks, more subsidies, making it even harder for us to compete. And the no tax on tip and the no tax on overtime and Social Security is a tiny tax deduction, like crumbs off of a banquet table, for everyday working class families in this state. It is not nearly the kind of relief from this tax burden that actual working class families deserve. And I think when we look at the investment that's being made, especially in the big beautiful bill, to the border security, I think we're looking at it being thrown away at incredibly high salaries and signing bonuses, in incredibly expensive mass deportations that are going to currently hurt our local economies, and not instead into the wise investment of border technology to catch fentanyl shipments across the border. Hiring the people that we need as immigration judges, immigration attorneys, to streamline the immigration process so that we can ensure that people coming into this country are safe and our communities are safe. So when I look at this big, beautiful bill, I can't help but think it's just another lie that working class America has had to put up with for over 40 years. Because I don't know how many more times we can hear that if we give tax cuts to the biggest businesses, if we give tax cuts to corporations and industries, then it will benefit our communities. Because so far we have lost $49 trillion in the last 40 years from working class local economies to the 1%. We have to do things differently. That's holding the top tax brackets accountable. That is cutting taxes on tips and overtime and Social Security, but in a real way that actually increases our take-home pay. Because I can guarantee you $150 is basically one trip to the fuel pump.
Border security remains one of the most polarizing national issues. Do you support Trump's plan for mass deportations and the expansion of powers to Department of Homeland Security and ICE? What approach do you believe would create the most effective and humane border policy?
I want to just point out there's a personal connection all over the country for this, and with the Flash Act, we're attempting to ensure Border Patrol has full access to federal lands. And even in my home state of Idaho, which is not a southern border state, we're actually a northern border state, but we have had the impacts of this substantially. We've got, in 2023 alone, 264 deaths related to fentanyl. And we've had 568 emergency department visits due to opioid overdose, and there were some deaths that occurred as a result of that too. So this is impacting all of us in a very significant way. And in your written testimony, Mr. Perez, you mentioned that you have greater access to privately held borderlands through partnerships.
Kaylee, same question.
It's difficult to address this in the way that my opponent often does, because I think we're confusing two entirely different issues. There is border security and immigration in this country, and there is the war on drugs and fentanyl in this country, and they are not connected. Sure, 90%. It's incredibly important to note 90% of the fentanyl in this country comes through legal ports of entry. Less than 1% of the people who are caught crossing the border are ever caught with fentanyl, and the vast majority of those who are caught with a tiny personal use because they are struggling with substance abuse issues as well. But that doesn't mean there isn't an immigration problem in this country. The bureaucracy, the time, the money, the inability for our federal agencies to keep up with immigration happening right now. And sure, COVID and Title 42 made it really difficult for us to catch up, but so did environmental and economic unrest in South and Central America. This was something that was happening even before the Biden administration as Trump was president. So why was that the case? It's because we didn't have the immigration judges, we didn't have the attorneys, we hadn't streamlined the immigration process in any real way in decades. That's the kind of investment that we need to be making, because what is happening right now in Wilder, Idaho, in the streets of Ada and Canyon and Gem and Elmore is our neighbors, our students, our coworkers, our workers are being rounded up without due process. And I hear so often from conservative voters saying they can't do that. They obviously have to have identified them as an undocumented person. They have to have the warrants, and that's just not the case. This administration has allowed ICE and the Department of Homeland Security to indefinitely detain anybody by the color of their skin, by the language that they speak, and considering our state is 14% Latino and Hispanic communities, these are our neighbors. These are Idaho's citizens that are being indefinitely detained. I think anytime a country has to make excuses for children being zip-tied in front of their family, we have gone far too far. I also question how we can afford to pay $100,000 salaries and $50,000 signing bonuses when teachers can only make $35,000 a year. There's one last aspect of this, though, that I want to address, and it's the war on drugs, and it's the opioid crisis. Because Russ Fulcher's numbers were accurate. When I go and I talk to millennials out of Kamiah, Idaho, they talk about 3 opportunities they have in life. They'll either get hooked on fentanyl, end up in jail, or work at the one employer locally. The opioid crisis has to be addressed as quickly as humanly possible. But criminalization and incarceration has failed for over 50 years, and it is the most expensive failure that this country's ever seen. Every single ounce of data and research that has been done on this topic shows that intervention, education, after-school programs, social services, checking in on the health and well-being of our children, preventing abuse, preventing substance abuse, is the best possible way that we can handle this. And we cannot afford to keep throwing every single person suffering with substance abuse in jail, because we, the taxpayers, cannot afford to pay that bill. There are way better ways we can go about it.
All right, we have reached our last debate question of the evening. Earlier this year, DOGE made massive cuts to federal agencies, including mass layoffs within the Forest Service here in Idaho's 1st District, and cuts to grants and funding for rural programs and research. How do you feel Congress should weigh fiscal restraint against maintaining the capacity of agencies that serve Idaho communities?
And that's the bottom line. At the end of the day, we're the stewards of the taxpayer in the nation, and so we're fighting stuff, and part of this is due to Elon Musk and this DOGE effort that is just incredibly wasteful and fraudulent. And why wouldn't everybody celebrate that? I mean, if we can identify enough dead people that we're paying Social Security to, as embarrassing as it is, that's money that we can put back in the system and salvage it over the course of time. So no, I mean, it's always unpleasant for somebody when you find something wasteful or fraudulent, but in the case of what is happening right now, I think it's a good thing. We should keep going.
Kaylee, same question.
I feel like this one might be the most unfair because we have the benefit of hindsight. I feel like when the congressman was addressing this issue, we had not fully experienced the impact of what these cuts were going to do. So I do want to preface what I'm about to say with this. But I have spoken to our Forest Service members. I have spoken to our federal employees who were terminated, not to mention that they were terminated on Valentine's Day, which I feel like we're not talking about enough. For the people who manage our lands and put so much of their own blood, sweat, and tears into trying to serve their community. I have once heard our congressman refer to these cuts as the federal agency is draining the swamp. In Idaho, 30% of federal employees are veterans, 50% of those are disabled veterans. When I look at the federal agencies that work our land or take care of our VA or protect our airport, this is not the swamp. These are people making the average payday that most working class families in this state are making. And I am sick and tired of working class people having to experience cut after cut while we ignore the hundreds of billions of dollars of handouts and subsidies and tax cuts that we give to already monopolized industries in this country. That's the way it's done. But now, with hindsight, we know that DOJ's efforts were more expensive than whatever savings they gave this country. And I can tell you, I have spoken to our students at the University of Idaho. I know I'm in Boise, so I should say BSU, but technically BSU isn't in my district. But I went to the University of Idaho and I talked to our students. And I talked to a student who was a hardcore MAGA Trump supporter up until these DOJ cuts, because this is a grad student that was working on his PhD in cancer research. They cut cancer research funding because of words like equity and female studies. DOJ cut grants to rural districts like ours because the words equity were used in talking about rural communities versus urban communities. Because the truth is, when we look at DEI in grant language, that applies to our veterans and our rural communities and areas without the privilege of the amount of tax revenue that the Treasure Valley might have. So when I look at what DOJ has done, it has once again just pointed the finger at the people who are really carrying the large amount of the labor that our government actually works to provide for us. These are essential services managing our lands. When I talk to our Forest Service employees, their biggest fear was that they no longer had enough employees to have relief crews during the fire season. They now were going to have to work fires to an unsafe level because there was no relief crew to come give them a break. This puts our federal employees in harm's way day in and day out, especially when fire is such a huge priority in the state of Idaho, fire prevention. So the funny thing is, I ran in 2022 on wanting to audit the government because I actually agreed with the premise. I 100% want a thorough audit of every single taxpayer dollar that is spent. And I too want to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, but it's not Social Security recipients, it's not veterans or VA employees. It is monopolized industries that spent $4 billion lobbying Congress in 2022.
All right, we're now going to enter a rapid fire round where I'm going to read comments from a comment section and allow Kaylee a chance to address them. I will be reading them as they are written, not necessarily grammatically how we would say these things, but. Why would Russ debate? She's not a viable contender, and he should be spending his time working for the people, not debating every person who wants to debate. You think debating is just showing up? It takes time to prepare, in addition to the time it takes to show up, and that's time spent not working for the people. I have no clue why you think everyone who challenges someone to a debate deserves the time, period.
I should preface this by saying I thought the rapid fire round was going to be a good way to address some of the concerns that got brought up around this debate. Because concerns of a congressional debate with only one opponent where another is a cardboard cutout while Congress is in session, there are some valid questions here. But I also thought it was important to address some of the comments that we get from the right, some of the misunderstandings, and actually look at the reality of the situation. I started this campaign in 2022 when the vast majority of the district was dark, meaning there were no Democrats on the ballot. There was no local Democratic Party. There had been no progressive infrastructure. When I started this, I got in my car, I drove up and down this district facing death threats. My first press conference was across the street from militant extremists who circled our event, revving their engines with their white power flags. That has been the reality of my experience. But then as I traveled the district, I realized we each define our political label differently. When I talk to conservatives and Republicans across the state of Idaho, they talk about wanting to decrease the deficit. They talk about wanting to increase the local revenue and boost local economies and offer local students opportunity. They talk about how important it is to support small business and competition in the markets, and I agree with all of those things. But the number of people who have never heard of my campaign, it is incredibly difficult to try and reach 1.2 million people in a district that doesn't even have local media north of Lewiston. And I have been on the ground hosting in-person town halls, day in and day out. I have hosted dozens and dozens of town halls. I have sat down with our Forest Service and our VA and our veterans. I have sat down with healthcare workers and providers and voters and small businesses and small family farms. I have sat down with the people who are impacted by the policy of our current congressman that have never once seen Russ Fulcher in person, that have never once showed up in this community. And you look at our campaign contributions, you can follow me across the state with every dollar I spend at a gas station pump or at a $40 motel on the outside of Orfino because it's getting dark and I can't drive home. But you look at Russ Fulcher's same FEC reports, and he spends over $84,000 on food at luxury lunch spots in DC and Tamarack Resort and Coeur d'Alene Resort. When he stays in Idaho, he stays at Tamarack Resort and Coeur d'Alene Resort. This campaign is not about me. This campaign has never been about Kaylee and Russ Fulcher. It has been about a movement uniting Idaho communities. Working class voters, whether you're independent, Democrat, Republican, I don't care. Uniting our communities across a hyper-partisan divide that has become toxic for each and every one of us and has done absolutely no good when it comes to the policy we each experience day in and day out. But also, I do want to say, as someone that has held constant in-person town halls and in-person events, the number one thing I hear from everybody, whether they're an Eisenhower Republican, Reagan Republican, independent, unaffiliated voter in this district, is they wish our elected officials would spend time getting to know the communities they represent. This debate was never about me getting to face off with Russ Fulcher. It's about me trying to use this platform to get Russ Fulcher to show up for you and for the people of this state, and that's the point.
She is not a serious candidate.
Oh, is that it?
That's all that's written. I can make up more. I can ad-lib it in comment section.
I want us to start looking at how we define the candidates we support. Because I think we in this country have gotten far too used to looking for perfect, polished politicians who can spend millions on fancy events and advertising and commercials, when that doesn't actually matter when you go back to DC. What actually matters is whether somebody knows how to bring stakeholders to the table and find legislative solutions. What actually matters is the amount of time that an elected official spends over the data and the research and the personal perspective, making sure that we have policy that works not just in the short term, but the long term. It's important that we start defining the candidates on the ballot by more than some perfect polished image, because I can guarantee you, anybody on TV claiming to be a perfect polished politician is lying. Because every single human being has gone through something in life that makes them unique, authentic. And what we desperately need right now are people who understand what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. Somebody who understands what it's like to worry that they'll never be able to afford home ownership especially when we're competing with investment firms and hedge funds. Somebody who understands what it's like to be forced to stay at home because you can't afford to provide preschool to your child, something that is given out 85% of the rest of the country. So I want us to start defining serious candidates differently. The amount of time that they spend in communities listening to voters, the amount of time that they spend trying to understand the other side, understand across the aisle. Because I don't care how much you made last year or your fancy resume, I care about whether or not you will show up and do the work and then go back to DC and actually fight for the people who put their trust and their faith in you. So I hope to be that kind of candidate.
It's easy to answer questions when you've had time to think about them and do research, etc. So she'll be taking questions he answered on the fly and answering them after having time to think about it. Not really impressive at all. But leftists are easy to manipulate into thinking something is impressive when it really isn't. Back to the subject. So now you're saying he has answered people and that your original statement of him avoiding being anywhere he might be faced with the voters of Idaho wasn't accurate. If it were, she wouldn't have his answers from other spaces, would she? Best of luck.
I wasn't sure how honest to be about this because I didn't want people to think I wasn't taking this seriously, but I come from a speech and debate background. Debate is one of my biggest passions in life. I love the ability to try and identify manipulative arguments, fight about the data and the research, get down to where we both stand and what actually holds up after argument. So when I put this idea together, I told my team, and they thought I was crazy, that I would not prep. I said I would not go through all of the questions, I would not pre-prepare, because I do love debate, and I have spent the last 4 years answering these questions in person, spontaneously through voter questions at town halls. But the idea that Russ Fulcher had to answer questions on the fly, the reason that you heard the questions you did tonight is because those were the only television interviews I could find where he answered those questions. This is a congressman with $1 million a year to pay his staff. This is a congressman with a 6-figure paycheck and free travel and health care who gets questions beforehand from news anchors with One American News Network, who got these prepared questions and then sat down in front of a camera and answered them. Tonight, I helped put the audio clips together, I helped organize this event, I carried a lot of the stuff that you see on the tables and behind the stage, carried that into the building, but I did not pre-prepare my answers to the questions tonight. I wanted to hear what Fulcher said and give the honest reaction that I have and what I tell every other Idaho voter when I travel the state talking about this. So I tried to make this as fair as I possibly could. But the truth is that if our congressman wants a fair shot of answering these questions, then he needs to show up. And I do want the people in this room to know this is not a one-off. My plan is to continue holding events just like this, from Lewiston to Coeur d'Alene. I hear Russ Fulcher is going to be in Kootenai County for the Lincoln Day dinner with Matt Gaetz, so we're looking at doing our next debate the day before or after. So maybe we can catch him while he is in town. But I want him to see the 450 people in the state of Idaho that registered to this event because they wanted to see what was said, because they wanted to hear from their elected representative, because they want to know what's on the ballot in the November 2026 midterm elections. So I didn't want you to think that I was taking this lightly by not preparing, but I think it's important I be authentic about what we did to set up this event. Also, I don't have $1 million in campaign funds. I don't have a full-time staff. I have dedicated volunteers who give all the extra time that they can, who have put blood, sweat, and tears into the movement that we're trying to create that made an event like today possible. And so I hope he knows how much sweat I spilled before the event even started, and what an advantage that definitely wasn't.
We care about our state, and we don't trust people with a D behind their name. We see what goes on in blue states, and we are not going there.
This is a very, very common sentiment. But then when because I have spent 4 years in Riggins, Idaho. I walked into the Seven Devil Saloon in Riggins, Idaho on a Sunday night and said, I'm a Democrat running for Congress. Tell me what's happening locally. I have walked in Orfino and Kamai and Bonners Ferry and Lewiston and Wallace, and I've talked to conservative Republican voters, and every critique that they have of me as a candidate is something they heard from social media about Democrats in this country. It never has anything to do with the policies that I support, with the work that I am trying to do, with what I want for this district, because I don't want Idaho to be the next Seattle or Portland or New York. I want to make sure that we are the most successful rural district in the country. I want to make sure that Idaho voters and working class families and students don't suffer because our federal government does not know how to increase revenue in a state like ours. I want to get the government out of our homes, our bedrooms, our love lives, our belief systems. I do not come from an all-progressive family. My dad was a hardcore Trump supporter, former Marine. My family were Eisenhower Republicans, as I like to call them. But what I grew up with in Idaho, walking my family's fields and working the fences and taking care of the yards down the neighborhood, was integrity and accountability and respect. And what they wanted from government was fiscal responsibility, accountability, and to get out of their homes. Whether you were gay or straight or a person of color or white, that the government respected each and every one of us equally and gave us all the exact same rights and protections. I don't call that some leftist, liberal, hoity-toity dream. I call that the promise of the Declaration of Independence. I call that the promise of the United States of America. My favorite statistic that I can use is I'm a huge labor first, union first candidate. And in Idaho, we actually have a huge union membership in the state, over 175,000 members of the AFL-CIO alone. But over 75% of those union members consider themselves Republicans. And every single time I visit their local meetings, every single time that I talk about wanting to repeal right to work, they go, are you gonna take my guns? I go, are you a violent offender? They say no, and I go, well then no, you're safe. So the D next to my name tells you absolutely nothing about my character, about my policy, about what I plan to do for this state. And we have to get louder and more present in rural conservative communities so that they can get to know me as their neighbor and not some social media soundbite used by the right to divide us.
I'd like to remind you, I'm just a vehicle for this comment.
I've heard words.
And I didn't choose it. I am so glad that Idaho is Republican and has common sense. We're firmly against sexual abuse, drugs, homelessness everywhere, people pooping on the sidewalks, raising taxes for illegals. We have constitutional carry here, lower taxes, lower gasoline. We just don't need the Democrat agenda here.
The problem is we don't actually look at the root causes of a lot of these issues that Idahoans are afraid of. And they have every right to fear these problems. We have gone through enormous population growth. Our housing market is something unrecognizable to what it was 8 years ago. The idea of homelessness and substance abuse issues and crime are very real issues that we should be talking about as Idaho continues to expand. But what I want to say is we've seen a conservative supermajority in this state for over 30 years. And they have not yet addressed these problems. Right. As our population grows, so does crime, so does homelessness. They have done nothing to make our housing market more affordable. So when our current leadership is failing, then I say let's talk about the actual solutions here. Because there are actual pieces of legislation in committee right now that Congress could take up that would immediately have a positive impact on these problems. There is a piece of legislation that would immediately ban the sale of single-family homes to investment firms and hedge funds in the U.S. They currently own over 26% of single-family homes in the U.S. That's estimated to be 40% by the year 2030. When I talk to rural communities, they call this the new form of fiefdom, because when investment firms buy up these properties, properties, they will never go back on market. Working class Idahoans will never have a chance at owning that home. Instead, we catch them artificially inflating the cost of rent or the cost of mortgages for their own benefit. And that's a solution that's right there in front of us that we can address today. A lot of the other solutions tend to be more local, but I mean, look at tax incentives. Right now in the US, we have such outdated tax codes. We give massive tax breaks to commercial developers who hold vacant commercial lots, when we could instead redefine that to incentivize affordable housing and real estate, especially in a district like Idaho's first. So when I look at these concerns, I understand them, and they are valid. And I think when we're working across the aisle, that's something we need to do more, is validate the fear and anger, because every person in this country, every working class person in this country has a right to be nervous right now, has a right to be angry at a government that does not represent or work for them. But once we identify what's actually causing those problems and we offer solutions, that is how we together as a state will move forward across the political labels that have divided us.
All right, that is all for our program tonight. I'm going to pass it over to Kaylee to wrap things up, but thank you so much to everyone who came and participated and got involved in the political process. Thank you.
Give it up for Lindsay, everybody. There were some things I wanted to talk about at wrap-up, but we've already addressed most of them. And that is that this is never meant to be a one-off night against Russ Fulcher. This is meant to be part of the movement that I've talked about. Part of the movement that we working class everyday people try and get our elected officials to engage with us again, to engage in the political process. I was a Lincoln Douglas debater, so that history of the role that it plays, and especially right now when people are sick and tired of a political system that is often frustrating and blatantly toxic. I don't know how else to describe this political process. But I want each and every elected official, each and every candidate to stand up on a stage like this and show communities how we can treat each other with respect while we talk about the issues that each and every one of us care about. So my hope here tonight is that this does not end in Boise, that this does not end in Lewiston or Coeur d'Alene, but ends with each and every candidate on the ballot in this state agreeing to show up and talk about the issues that they plan to solve for. And while tonight may have been a little imbalanced, I mean, we put boxes up so we didn't fall down. This night was never, ever about a one-off or showing Russ Fulcher. My hope is that he will now address the things that we've talked about tonight. My hope is that he will get up and start talking about the issues that I hear from everyday voters across the state. And my hope is that each and every person in this room now feels like they have a role to play in the 2026 midterm elections. Because whatever issue is important to you, whatever's happening in your life, I want you to have a government that will actually listen and address what is going on in your neighborhood, in your community. So all of us together get loud. If it's me and I said something you don't like tonight, let me know. I will sit down at the table and we can talk over the policy. But more than everything, help me by holding the most powerful and privileged among us accountable. Because I think we can all ask for that. Thank you so much, everybody. Be careful in the parking lot. Centennial has a lot of events going on tonight. But please have a wonderful evening. I appreciate each and every one of you for coming out and spending some time with us tonight. Thank you.